welcome to our lesson on equations of lines. Hello, welcome to online learning. So before we get into anything new, we are going to start by doing just some review of what we were doing before we were rudely interrupted with coronavirus. So the first thing we have is equations of lines. So two words that we need to remember are slope and y-intercept. An equation of lines refers most commonly to the equation y equals mx plus b. M stands for slope and b stands for y-intercept. These are the two parts of a line that you need to know and that distinguishes one line from another. So our slope formula is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So don't confuse that with y equals mx plus b. Y equals mx plus b is the equation of a line, but m equals y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1 is the slope formula. So your x1, x2, y1, y2 are all representing numbers from points. So in this case, the points that we are using would be x1, y1, and x2, y2, and so we're filling them into the equation as we see it there. So in the first example, we want to find the slope of the line that passes through the points. And in number 1, negative 8 is what we would call x1, and 4 is what we would call y1. So it's the x-coordinate and y-coordinate from the first point, and then for 6 and 2, we have the x-coordinate and y-coordinate of the second point, so we'll call them x2 and y2. So we're going to take these numbers and substitute them into our slope formula. It's always suggested that you start by writing down the formula. Once you have it filled in, evaluate using your order of operations. And your last step is to simplify. So if we have a line containing the points negative 8, 4, and 6, 2, the slope of that line would be negative 1 over 7. Example 2, we are practicing the same thing. If you want to try this on your own, then feel free to stop the video before we actually show the work. Next, let's talk about horizontal versus vertical lines. So horizontal lines would look like this. This right here would be the horizontal line y equals 2. So a way to remember horizontal versus vertical is hoi vux. So the H in hoi stands for horizontal. The O is actually a 0 for the 0 slope, and y equals because your horizontal lines are always y equals. So we say that this line has 0 slope because it is flat. And then for vux, the V stands for vertical. U stands for undefined. Vertical lines have an undefined slope. And X for x equals. So vertical lines look like this. They're going to be straight up and down. And this line right here would be called x equals negative 3. So for my line y equals 2, if I just take 2 points to calculate the slope, and let's say I'm choosing negative 1, 2, and negative 2, 2, and I plug them into the formula, just because I'm doing an example, I'm going to skip writing out the actual formula. But in the numerator, I have 2 minus 2, which is 0. In my denominator, I have negative 1. So this right here would be a 0 slope. If we remember slope as being rise over run, there's no rise, so it's a 0 slope. Now with my vertical line, let's say I pick these 2 points here. So I have 3, negative 1, and 3, 1. And when I go to calculate those, I'll have 1 minus negative 1 over 3 minus 3. So when I go to evaluate, I have 2 in the numerator and 0 in the denominator. So if you remember, having a 0 in the denominator is a big no-no. It's mathematically illegal, and that would cause us to have an undefined slope. When it comes to fractions, it's okay to have 0 in the numerator, but to have 0 in the denominator is not. So we have okay and no. So in our examples, we want to describe the slope of the lines. Now, if I have x equals 5, that would be a vertical line, so my slope would be undefined. In number 4, I have y equals negative 3x plus 2. So what I'm interested in is the negative 3. That's the part that tells me about the slope. If I'm looking at that line, if I were to have it graphed, I'd see that it is on a downward slope. So we say that it has a negative slope, which would be indicated by the negative number in front. So conversely, when we are looking at y equals 8x minus 1, the 8 is a positive number. So this function has a positive slope. And then when we get to number 6, y equals negative 2, remember that's a horizontal line, and horizontal lines have 0 slope. So there's actually a few different forms for the equation of a line. The most common and most popular, our favorite one, is the slope-intercept form. So that's where m equals the slope and b is equal to the y-intercept. So I'm going to put a star by this one because it's the most important. But you may encounter some other forms of a line like the point-slope form. So here we do still see the y, the m, the x. The part that's a little bit different is you have an x1 and a y1, and each one just stands for a coordinate from a point. And our last form is the standard form, which has ax plus by equals c. A, b, and c are all constants. Typically, when we see lines in point-slope form and especially standard form, we like to try to convert them into slope-intercept form. And that's because the slope-intercept form tells you about the slope and the y-intercept, and both are very important, especially if we're trying to graph a line. Point-slope form tells us the slope and a point on the line. It's still graphable. The standard form of a line would be the most difficult to try to graph from. So in examples 7 through 10, we are practicing converting an equation of a line into slope-intercept form. So your mission is to always get y by itself on one side of the equation. So in number 7, I have negative 3y equals x plus 9. So we're going to use inverse operations, and negative 3y means it's being multiplied. I want to undo that multiplication, and I will do that by dividing. So I will divide both sides by negative 3. So some students like to show that division this way and say that they're going to take the whole right side and divide it by negative 3. The problem with that is that I usually see students come up with answers that look like this afterward. So the problem is that they have to divide everything on the right side by negative 3, and according to what we have here, that did not happen. So I strongly recommend writing the divide by negative 3 to each individual piece that you see. And that ensures that we get the correct equation of a line for our final answer. So let's talk about what happened, how we went from x over negative 3 to a negative 1/3 x down here. So remember that when you see x by itself, there's always that invisible 1 in front of it. And now we are taking that and dividing it by 3. So I could have x over negative 3, or I could have negative 1/3 times x. They both mean the same thing. Since slope is the rise over the run, we usually like to see a number for the rise and a number for the run. So that's why we will rewrite the slope to always be a fraction. Number 8, same idea. I want to get y by itself. So I'm going to have to take care of this 4x in front of it by subtracting it from both sides. So I will have 2y on the left, and just be careful that you don't get something like 6x. Remember, they are not like terms, so they cannot be combined that way. So I will rewrite this as negative 4x plus 10. And now my last step is to take everything and divide it by 2 so that I can get y by itself. Y equals negative 2x plus 5 is my final answer. Now pause the video here and try number 9. Okay, now check your work. And then number 10 is giving us an equation that is in point-slope form. So the slope is already there, but we are trying to convert it to slope-intercept form so that we know what our y-intercept is. The only thing here that will be any different is we're going to take that 1/3 and start by distributing it. Afterward, we're able to process the rest of the equation normally. and then y equals 1/3 x minus 10 is our final answer. These are the steps for writing equations of a line. Start by analyzing the information that you're given. In the geometry course that I teach, students are always given a point and a slope. Substitute that information into y equals mx plus b, and then we're solving for b because we were already given the slope. Your final step is to rewrite as y equals mx plus b, where m and b are replaced with the actual slope and y-intercept. So x and y should still be there at the end, and your final answer is an equation. So with y equals mx plus b, my x and y are coming from the point. So remember how it's always x first and then y. So y is -3, m is -1/2, x is -1, and b is still b because that is what we are looking for. Then I multiply my -1/2 times -1 to get a +1/2. And then to get b by itself, I must subtract the 1/2. So -3 minus 1/2 is -7/2. So that is something you can find using your graphing calculator. And we typically like to express both slope and the y-intercept in fractions rather than decimals in the case of graphing lines. Now here you can pause the video and try number 12. So for our final answer, we have y equals -3/2 x plus 5. I will be sharing two methods for graphing lines. The first method is the calculator method. So you simply type the equation into a graphing calculator, go to the table, and use the table of values to plot your points. So this would be the TI Inspire iPad app. So my first step is to type in the equation, and then I can hit enter, and I see my graph. So in my table, I'm seeing a lot of decimals. What I want to do is use any value that is using whole numbers. So I'm going to take those whole number values and put them next to my graph in the T-chart. Then I can go ahead and plot my points. So you need a minimum of 3 points to get a straight line, and once I have that, then I can graph my line and make sure, because it's a line, it goes on forever. We add endpoints, and it's a good habit to label your line with the equation. The second method is my favorite because it's honestly a lot faster. And for this method, we just analyze the equation. Determine the y-intercept, plot the point on the y-axis, determine the slope, and then count the rise over run from the y-intercept until you have at least 3 points. So in my equation, my y-intercept is -8. So on my y-axis, I look for -8 and plot my point. And then my slope is always the number in front of x, so that would be 4/3. So that means I will rise 4 and run 3. And we always run to the right if we have the space to. So I'm counting up 1, 2, 3, 4, and then to the right 1, 2, 3, plot a point, and then again 1, 2, 3, 4 up, 1, 2, 3 to the right, plot my point, and then draw my line. Again, add your arrows and a label, and you're done. So after this lesson, you have a Google form to answer questions for. It's a little bit of a longer form just because this was a review lesson.